What if the smear campaign everyone believed never actually existed? For months, the narrative has been clear. Blake Lively was the victim of an untraceable smear campaign, Justin Baldoni was allegedly behind it, and the New York Times presented text messages that seemed to confirm everything. The story spread fast, headlines followed, opinions hardened, and confirmation bias did the rest. But once the unsealed evidence came out, once the full text messages surfaced, once discovery revealed what was left out, the story began to fracture. Because when you look at the complete context, something uncomfortable emerges. The smear campaign Blake Lively claimed may not have happened at all. Instead, the evidence points in a very different direction, one involving a former publicist, a stolen phone, alleged privacy violations, and text messages that were selectively framed. It raises serious questions about how narratives are manufactured, how media outlets like the New York Times handle incomplete information, and how easily false allegations can take on a life of their own. At the center of it all is a name most people overlooked at first, Stephanie Jones. And once you understand her role, her motives, and the evidence tied to her actions, the entire case against Justin Baldoni begins to look less like justice and more like projection, deflection, and a story built on missing context. Because if the smear campaign wasn't real, then who was actually behind the damage? Everyone keeps repeating the same phrase, the smear campaign. But when you slow down and actually examine the unsealed evidence, the first crack appears almost immediately because there's no clear proof that a smear campaign against Blake Lively ever existed in the first place. What there is, however, is a narrative built on fragments, select text messages, headlines pulled out of context, and a version of events that assumes intent before verifying facts. This is where confirmation bias quietly takes control. Once a belief is formed, every new piece of information is forced to fit it, even when the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. The New York Times relied heavily on text messages provided through discovery, presenting them as proof of a coordinated effort to manipulate press coverage. But those messages were never shown in full. Entire sections of the text thread were missing, and when the complete 14-page conversation is reviewed, the meaning changes dramatically. Instead of showing a smear campaign being executed, the messages reveal confusion, mixed messaging between multiple parties, overlapping PR strategies, and reactive damage control. In other words, not an organized plot, but a mess. A mess created by too many voices talking to the press at the same time. What's critical here is what isn't in the texts. There are no instructions to plant stories, no coordinated plan to destroy Blake Lively, no evidence of Justin Baldoni directing a negative media push. And yet, the accusations stuck, because once a narrative gains momentum, absence of proof doesn't slow it down. Even more telling is how the phrase "creating confusion" was framed. Pulled out of context, it sounds incriminating. In full context, it refers to conflicting narratives already circulating, narratives that someone else had introduced before any counter-narrative was ever issued. This distinction matters. Responding to press is not the same as planting press. Cleaning up misinformation is not the same as starting it. But when selective excerpts are elevated to evidence, those lines blur just enough to convince the public that something darker must be happening. So the question becomes unavoidable. If there was no organized smear campaign, why was everyone so certain there was one? Because the story didn't begin with proof, it began with an assumption. And once that assumption was accepted, every new detail was filtered through it, even when the full discovery told a different story. And that brings us to the next turning point, because this entire case, this entire narrative collapse, hinges on one person, someone who wasn't supposed to be part of the story at all. And once she enters the picture, everything changes. Every story like this has a moment where the narrative quietly shifts, where the focus moves away from the headline names and lands on the person operating behind the scenes. In this case, that moment begins with Stephanie Jones. Stephanie Jones wasn't a random outsider. She was Justin Baldoni's former publicist, someone entrusted with private information, confidential communications, and a legal duty to protect her client. But after her professional relationship with Justin soured, and after her former employee Jen Abel left, something changed. And that change would become the foundation of everything that followed. According to deposition testimony, Stephanie came into possession of Jen Abel's phone under circumstances that raise immediate red flags. The phone wasn't voluntarily given for open access. It was allegedly handed over under a specific promise that the passcode would be used only to transfer the phone at Verizon. That transfer never happened. Instead, Jen Abel found herself without a phone, without a number, and completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. This is where privacy violations entered the story, because the phone didn't just contain personal data. It contained text messages, conversations, and communications that would later appear in discovery, messages that would eventually be framed as evidence of a smear campaign, messages that Jen Abel herself did not have access to anymore. Stephanie's role doesn't stop at possession. Her deposition reveals something else: motive. She openly expresses deep hostility toward Melissa Nathan, repeatedly characterizing her as unethical, dangerous, and manipulative. This wasn't a professional disagreement, it was personal. And that personal resentment centered heavily around Scooter Braun, Melissa's professional success, and the fact that Stephanie had lost influence and clients. What's important here is timing. Before Blake Lively and Stephanie Jones ever spoke, there was no relationship between them at all, no history, no trust. And yet, on the very day Stephanie obtained access to the phone, Blake was contacted and warned about alleged misconduct, framed as something urgent, disturbing, and explosive. That framing matters because it positions Stephanie not as a neutral party, but as a messenger, delivering a story that would later become the backbone of Blake's belief system. A story reinforced by selective texts, a story presented as proof rather than speculation. And once that story was accepted, it no longer mattered where it came from or how it was obtained. Because the next question isn't just why Stephanie Jones told this story, it's how the contents of that phone were later used, and who benefited most from the way those messages were framed. Everything changes the moment private messages stop being private and start being used as weapons. At the center of this case is not just a phone, but what access to that phone made possible. Because once Stephanie Jones had control of Jen Abel's device, she wasn't just holding hardware, she was holding years of conversations, context-free fragments, and the power to decide what would be seen and what would disappear. According to the evidence, Jen Abel did not retain access to her own phone after handing it over. She did not have the ability to review the messages later presented in discovery. That means the version of events introduced into legal filings and media narratives came through a single gatekeeper. And that gatekeeper was someone with clear animosity toward Melissa Nathan and unresolved conflict with Justin Baldoni. This is where discovery becomes critical. The public was told that text messages proved a coordinated smear campaign, but discovery didn't reveal a clean timeline or a complete narrative. It revealed selective screenshots, partial threads, excerpts presented without surrounding context. And when the full 14-page text exchange is examined, the meaning shifts. Rather than plotting or planting stories, the messages show reactive communication, responding to incoming press inquiries, correcting misinformation, and dealing with mixed messaging that was already circulating. The confusion referenced in the texts wasn't manufactured by Melissa Nathan or Justin Baldoni's team, it was inherited. And yet, those same texts were later cited as proof of wrongdoing, proof that evaporates when the full conversation is visible. What makes this more troubling is how those messages traveled. They didn't remain inside legal boundaries. They became talking points. They were summarized, reframed, and elevated into a media narrative. And once that happened, nuance disappeared. The public wasn't shown a conversation, they were shown a conclusion. This raises a fundamental question. If the messages were so damning, why wasn't the entire text thread released up front? The answer seems obvious. Full context complicates simple accusations. It introduces ambiguity. It forces readers to confront the difference between responding to press and manipulating it. And ambiguity doesn't fuel outrage the way certainty does. Once fragments of the texts were positioned as evidence, the narrative hardened. Any attempt to explain context could be dismissed as spin. The damage was already done, not because of what the messages said, but because of how they were framed. And framing, in this case, is everything. Because the more closely you examine how those texts were used, the clearer it becomes that this story was never just about Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni, it was about someone else entirely, and a conflict that started long before any headlines appeared. Once you stop asking who the story was about and start asking who it was really aimed at, the entire narrative flips. Because when you strip away the headlines, the lawsuits, and the media noise, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Melissa Nathan wasn't a side character in this story. She was the central problem, at least in the eyes of Stephanie Jones. Stephanie's deposition testimony reveals a fixation that goes far beyond professional disagreement. She repeatedly frames Melissa as unethical, dangerous, and manipulative, tying her objections to a past incident involving Scooter Braun and a tragic but unrelated death that authorities never treated as criminal. Despite no charges, no findings of wrongdoing, and no verified cover-up, the story is repeatedly resurrected as evidence of moral failure. That's not accidental. It serves a purpose. By portraying Melissa as someone capable of hiding the truth, it becomes easier to accuse her of planting stories, steering narratives, and orchestrating smear campaigns without needing proof. But motive matters. Melissa Nathan didn't just work in crisis PR. She worked closely with Scooter Braun. She built trust, and eventually, Scooter chose to support her professionally, funding her PR firm and taking his business elsewhere. For Stephanie Jones, that choice represented loss of influence, of clients, and of relevance. This is where resentment turns into retaliation. Text messages show Stephanie attempting to warn others not to work with Melissa, reaching out to Tara Hanks, and even contacting Scooter Braun directly. She speculates, without evidence, that Melissa was planting stories to later kill them and present herself as a hero. Ironically, this is the exact behavior former employees accused Stephanie of in the Business Insider article. Projection becomes unmistakable here. The accusation mirrors the criticism. What's crucial is that none of this had anything to do with Blake Lively, at least not at first. Blake enters the story only after Stephanie needs an ally, someone who can amplify the narrative, someone emotionally primed to believe that they're being targeted. And once Blake accepts that framework, that Melissa Nathan is the villain, the rest falls into place. The texts become evidence, the confusion becomes intent, the smear campaign becomes fact. But it wasn't born from facts, it was born from grievance. Because once you understand that Melissa was the real target, a more unsettling question emerges. If this wasn't about protecting Blake Lively, then who was actually creating the chaos in the press? If you want to understand how this story spiraled out of control, you don't start with accusations. You start with the press pipeline. Because what the text messages actually reveal isn't a smear campaign being launched, but a media environment flooded with mixed messaging. Different parties speaking to different outlets, multiple narratives circulating at the same time, and reporters trying to make sense of conflicting versions of the same event. The Daily Mail becomes a critical junction point, not as the origin of the narrative, but as the place where confusion crystallized into headlines. According to the full text thread, initial contact with the press didn't come from Melissa Nathan. It came after stories were already being shaped elsewhere, after others had spoken, reframed, and redirected the narrative. When Melissa did engage, it wasn't to plant new stories. It was to respond, to correct, to push back against what had already been introduced. This is standard crisis PR, counter-narrative, not creation. But once selective excerpts are removed from that context, response begins to look like orchestration. The same pattern repeats with the New York Post, and later the New York Times. Fragments of conversations are elevated, words like confusion are stripped of their explanation, and suddenly, what was once a reaction becomes evidence of intent. What's missing from the coverage is the full timeline, the order of who spoke first, who contacted which outlet, and why Melissa was constantly responding instead of initiating. Without that sequence, the audience is left with a distorted picture, one where the loudest accusation becomes the most believable. Even more revealing is what the messages say about the pressure behind the scenes. Calls coming in nonstop, headlines changing by the hour, internal acknowledgement that the sheer volume of press, not its content, was driving chaos. Too many stories, too many angles, too much noise. This isn't what a coordinated smear campaign looks like. It's what happens when multiple people try to control a narrative at the same time, and no one fully succeeds. Yet once the New York Times framed this confusion as manipulation, the label stuck. The public wasn't invited to examine the mechanics, they were handed a conclusion. And conclusions, once published, are hard to undo. Because if the media chaos wasn't manufactured by Melissa Nathan or Justin Baldoni's team, the final question becomes unavoidable. Why was Blake Lively so certain she was under attack, and who convinced her of that? When someone is convinced they're being targeted, evidence stops being evaluated and starts being filtered. This is where psychology matters more than paperwork, because Blake Lively didn't need to see every text message or verify every timeline. Once the idea of a smear campaign took hold, confirmation bias did the rest. Every headline felt hostile, every critical article felt coordinated, and every reassurance that the evidence didn't fully support the claim felt like denial. Stephanie Jones didn't present herself as an aggressor. She positioned herself as a warning system, a messenger bringing alarming information, framed as urgent and deeply disturbing. That framing matters because it bypasses skepticism and goes straight to emotion, especially when the message is delivered as protection rather than accusation. At the same time, Blake was surrounded by voices reinforcing the same narrative. Leslie Sloan's involvement added another layer of validation. When multiple people echo the same concern, it stops sounding like speculation and starts sounding like consensus. And once consensus forms, dissent feels dangerous. The problem is that consensus doesn't equal truth. The text messages that supposedly proved intent were never examined in full by Blake. They didn't need to be. The story they supported was already emotionally believable. And when the New York Times later echoed that framing, it provided institutional confirmation. The narrative was no longer just personal, it was public record. This is how belief hardens, not through facts, but through repetition, not through evidence, but through alignment. The more Blake heard the same explanation from the same small circle, the less reason she had to question it. What's especially tragic is that this belief system didn't protect her, it trapped her. Because once she aligned herself with Stephanie Jones and Leslie Sloan, retreat became almost impossible. Backing out would require acknowledging that the wrong person had been trusted, that the wrong story had been believed, and that the real damage may have come from inside her own circle. Instead of stepping away, the alliance solidified, not because it was true, but because it was mutually reinforcing. And once everyone involved was locked into the same narrative, there was only one way forward: either expose the truth in full or let the damage stand and pretend it was justice. When you step back and look at the entire picture, not fragments, not headlines, not selective text messages, the story changes. What was presented as a smear campaign begins to look like something else entirely: a collapse of trust, a weaponized narrative, and a chain reaction driven by bias rather than proof. Justin Baldoni's reputation didn't suffer because of evidence. Melissa Nathan wasn't targeted because of facts, and Blake Lively didn't end up here because the truth was clear. It all unraveled because context was stripped away, piece by piece, until only one version of events remained visible. And that's the uncomfortable takeaway. Not that mistakes were made, but that so many people were willing to accept an incomplete story as final. Because once a narrative is published and repeated, correcting it becomes almost impossible, even when the full text threads, the discovery, and the timelines tell a very different story. If you value full context over headlines and facts over framing, make sure to like this video. It helps more people see deeper breakdowns like this. And subscribe if you want continued coverage that slows things down, examines the evidence, and asks the questions most stories avoid. Because the truth isn't loud, but it's always there for those willing to look.